For those of you who may not have heard the term before, a liminal space generally refers to an empty or abandoned place that can come across as eerie or unnerving. However, one might feel other emotions as well, such as nostalgia. Liminal can mean transition or threshold, and might apply to a long hallway or a house where the last family moved out, but another has yet to move in. Liminal spaces can also include open fields, shopping malls, office buildings, and playgrounds. Personally, I find the idea of liminal spaces fascinating, but whether you're a fan of the aesthetic or not, I just hope you have a good time listening to these stories. At the time this story takes place, I was the general manager of one of our company's warehouse and distribution centers. I don't want to mention where I work, as I'm still there, but none of the details really matter. And on the other hand, maybe it was the emptiness of the situation that made it downright terrifying. Our particular site was being expanded with 2 new, large warehouses, and had been under construction for well over a year. I and other people from the company would visit the areas under construction to ensure that things were staying on track, and as I was the general manager and located on site, I'd visit there frequently. Though the expansion ended up over budget and a few months behind schedule, it finally finished, and there was going to be a celebration the next week. The warehouses would soon start filling up, but currently they were empty, and without workmen in there, it was downright eerie. Each of the 2 warehouses were over 20,000 square feet, so it was definitely strange to see them completely empty. On this one evening, after I had finished what I needed to, I decided to walk over and inspect both warehouses. Everything was in one gigantic building, and after leaving the office section of the building, I had to walk for about 5 minutes down various corridors to get to them. No one was in the corridors at this instant, though there'd usually be a forklift or 2 passing by, loading or unloading an 18-wheeler. Anyway, when I came to the first of the 2 new warehouses, I stepped through one of the sets of plastic flaps. I was greeted by dead silence and almost complete darkness, save for the tiny bit of light coming through the plastic flaps. I stopped for a moment, just taking it in. I turned on the lights from the nearby control panel, and a moment later the darkness had disappeared. We had LED lights, not fluorescent ones, so it was still dead quiet. Both to check for anything left behind, and to get some exercise, I decided to walk the perimeter. I was about 1/4 of the way around when I noticed something by the wall opposite me. It was a black tarp, or rather, something hidden underneath a black tarp. I had no idea what it was. To be clear though, I wasn't suspicious yet, as I was assuming it was just a piece of equipment left by one of the work crews. I didn't even go out of my way to get to it. Rather, I just kept walking along the perimeter of the warehouse, at the gentle pace I had been going. While I walked, I looked up and admired all the metal beams and lights on the ceiling, and continued to take in the ambiance. Finally, I turned the last corner and started heading back to the entrance where I came in. But then I stopped. That thing in the tarp was still there, but it was right up against one of the support pillars, not the wall where I thought it had been earlier. I was taken aback, but I also wasn't 100% sure that it had moved. Maybe I was just mistaken earlier. I stopped walking and listened and looked at the tarp, but I couldn't hear or see anything. I walked towards it again, now a bit on edge. When I was 20 feet away, I thought I could hear something, and I stopped dead in my tracks. It sounded like breathing. My stomach dropped as that confirmed my sinking suspicion, and I froze, contemplating my options. I thought about confronting that person, but decided against it. While I could probably handle myself in a fight, I also had no idea if whoever was under there was armed. I also considered making a break for the door. Instead, I started walking again, trying to play it off like I didn't notice anyone was there. It must have worked, because as I was exiting, I kept glancing back and the tarp hadn't moved. Once I got outside, I quickened my pace. There was a supervisor's room nearby where I planned to lock myself in while I called the police to report an intruder. But when I was almost there, I heard manic footsteps followed a second later by someone crashing through the plastic flaps. I turned and saw a man dressed in all black, running straight at me. In that moment, the universe shrank to a single point, and I took off running probably as fast as when I was on the high school track team. I got to the room and slammed the door behind me. Thank God I had my keys handy, for no sooner had I locked the door than the man, at least I assume it was a man, started pounding on it. The control room had large windows, but they had a wire mesh in them, so I felt relatively safe. My phone didn't have reception where I was in the building, but there were phones in the control room, and I promptly picked one up and dialed 911. I almost dropped the phone when the man walked out from behind the other side of the door and directly in front of where I was standing. I could see him plainly through the glass, but because he was wearing a black hoodie, pants, and face mask, I couldn't make out any of his features. Our eyes locked for a moment, and I expected him to start pounding the glass any second, but he didn't. Instead, he turned and calmly walked away out of my field of view. As I was waiting for the cops to arrive, I tried but failed to pull up the surveillance system, but I did manage to issue a warning on the PA system that there was a suspicious man in the building, and for any employees still present to go into lockdown. The cops showed up 10 minutes later, and thankfully the other 5 or so employees still present were all okay. At that point, we were able to pull up the footage, which showed that the man started running soon after he left my area, and then ran outside of the building and down the street. Interestingly, he had entered the building through an unlocked door only a few minutes before I left the office part of the building to inspect the warehouses. He apparently ducked into the warehouse to hide from me. That's about the end of the story. I identified who had been responsible for locking that particular door, and though I considered reprimanding them, I think they felt pretty bad already. They also had some personal stuff going on, so I just let it go, but told them that if it happened again, there would be consequences. The celebration took place the next week as planned, and activity in the warehouse part of the building picked up significantly as those 2 new warehouses had come online. In the end, I'll never forget that experience, and how strange and eerie the whole encounter was. Finding that man in the middle of a completely empty and silent warehouse is a downright terrifying thought. I also have to wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't made it to that room in time? This incident only took place 2 weeks ago, so it's still very fresh in my mind. And while I don't believe in the paranormal, this experience made me question it just a little bit. I guess it was due to the environment and my state of mind, but I'm not sure if I'll ever get over it entirely. For backstory, I work at our city's rec center. Our city isn't very big, and the rec center isn't either. There are 2 levels, with offices, 2 basketball courts, a weight room and conference rooms on the ground level, and cardio machines and a track on the upper level. The 2 basketball courts are in one large area and can be used for other activities such as pickleball. There's also a fabric divider that's usually lowered during the day to separate them. The track runs around the top and looks down on the basketball area. I really enjoyed my job, and for the most part I still do, but maybe that's what makes this experience even stranger. On the particular night in question, the rec center closed down at 10 p.m., and I had to make sure everything was cleaned up and locked up. I'd only ever closed the building a handful of times, and though the experience creeped me out a bit, I wouldn't say I was scared. Most everything had already been put away at this point, including the stuff in the basketball area. That included raising the divider between the courts, raising the hoops towards the ceiling, and pushing in the bleachers against the wall. Personally, I thought it was eerie, but also kinda cool to see things like that. I walked through the weight room, making sure all the weights had been put away. A few were still left out, so I went ahead and racked them. When I did, I could swear I heard a noise coming from somewhere above me. That meant it was in the cardio area. It seemed like something had been dragged a small distance across the floor, but it was really quiet and I couldn't quite make it out. I also wasn't completely sure if it was real, or if I just imagined it. I did one last check of the weight room, then I walked up a set of stairs which connected the weight room and cardio area. When I got to the top, I saw nothing. I walked around inspecting the machines, which included treadmills, ellipticals, and a few other types. Nothing seemed out of place, and I had no idea what or how something could have been moved. The cardio area was at one end of a building, which was made out of huge windows, and it looked out onto a pond and walking trail. Though, since it was around 10:30, it was pitch black aside from some streetlights off in the distance. Combined with hearing that noise, I was starting to get a bit freaked out. Next, I walked out onto the track and scanned the area. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed quietly, but pretty soon the silence was interrupted by that same kind of sound. This time it seemed to come from right below me. Therefore, I walked around the track a bit until I could see what was underneath where I'd been standing. But by the time I got there, whatever had made that noise was gone. I was starting to think my mind was playing tricks on me, but just then I heard the sound coming from below me again. This couldn't just be the track creaking, could it? I continued walking, and this scenario repeated a few more times. By the time I made one full lap around the track, which I think was 1/10 of a mile, I was freaked out. I was like 95% sure that there was someone messing with me down there. I thought about it being one of my coworkers and considered calling out for whoever that was to stop it. But this had already been going on for 15 minutes, and none of my coworkers who worked that evening seemed like the type of people to keep up a prank for that long, after we were closed. That meant it was either one of the patrons who didn't leave, or else someone who entered the building from the outside. Neither of those options was good, and I started to feel chills down my spine. I quietly exited the track where I had come in, then went down another set of stairs that led more directly to the little office area near the front of the building. I felt marginally safer there since it was right by the main entrance, meaning I could get out quickly. I activated the PA system and made an announcement that we were closed, and whoever was still in the building needed to leave immediately. I felt myself trembling as I waited to hear footsteps and for some random person to come into view. But after 5 minutes, no one did. It seemed that whoever was in there with me wasn't coming out. It was almost 11 at this point, and I had to figure out what to do. Up until this point, all of the lights were on, and it was my job to turn them off. It was also my duty to make sure that no one else was in the building before leaving. I hadn't actually played through the scenario of someone maliciously staying in the building before, as our city had a really nice community, and almost all of our patrons were very well behaved. I'm not sure why I didn't call one of my coworkers, or call the police at that point. Maybe because I still had a tiny bit of doubt that what I'd been hearing was real. Anyway, I decided that I'd walk around one more time while mentally delaying the decision of whether or not I should check in the bathrooms. I ended up compromising and decided to call out for anyone still present to leave while I was near but outside of the bathrooms. There were several larger bathrooms with locker rooms inside, as well as several individual bathrooms, and though I hadn't been told explicitly that I needed to check inside each of them, I figured I was supposed to do it. That said, I was way too freaked out to go in there, and told myself that even if I did, whoever could be hiding would just hide from me inside. I can't convey in words how I felt walking to each area of the building, calling out for anyone to leave, and then turning off the lights. I knew I was getting paranoid, and after a minute or two I was practically running. Finally, the last two areas still lit up were the basketball courts and the front of the building, the latter of which I turned off right before leaving. I heard my voice echo as I stood at one of the entrances to the courts, then heard the hum cut off as everything was plunged into darkness. Then, one final time, I heard the noise come from somewhere across the courts and above me. Instinctively I looked up, and in that moment I felt more terror than at any other time in my life. There, on the track above the basketball courts, was a figure in all black. I screamed like a little girl and ran out of the building. Once outside, I got into my car and locked it and dialed 911. I explained that there was an intruder in the building, and 10 minutes later 2 cops showed up. All the while, I was holding my breath, waiting to see whoever was in there to run outside, but they never did. I gave the cops the person's description, or rather, the lack of description, and they told me they'd check it out. I went with them back inside and we walked around, turning the lights on. We checked everywhere, including the closets and bathrooms, but whoever was there was gone. But that was also strange, since only the front doors were unlocked and I hadn't seen anyone leave. I met our manager at the rec center when it opened at 6 the next day. Our manager, who is a sweet old lady, asked how I was doing. I was feeling a lot less anxious, maybe because she put me at ease, and we both sat down to watch the surveillance footage. What we saw was shocking, or maybe I should say, what we didn't see. We checked the feed from every camera throughout the entire night, and there was no one there besides me. We even saw the part where I walked briefly onto the basketball court, stopped, looked up, and then turned and ran. There was no one standing on the track above me. I must have replayed that part at least 10 times, looking for any evidence someone was there or if there could have been a shadow. But no, there was nothing. I felt like the biggest wussy in the world, but to her credit, our manager didn't seem upset. Instead, she tried to comfort me and told me that we all imagine things from time to time. She told me I wouldn't have to close up if I didn't want to, but maybe because I wanted to save a bit of my dignity, I told her I'd be alright. I also worked out a system where I could start making sure no patrons were in the building before my other coworkers left for the night. That seemed to work, though I would still get mildly terrified near closing. Looking back, I'm not sure exactly why I saw what I saw. I do have migraines, and I'm on medication for that, but I'd only ever seen bright lights in a small part of my vision, and the last time that happened was over a year ago. I'd also gotten plenty of sleep the night before, and I felt well rested. Another theory I came up with was that I imagined that person standing on the track above me because I'd played the game/walking simulator Dear Esther. I'd found a few of the secrets of the game, including the structure of the antacid molecule ranitidine on the group of standing stones. But the relevant was in the lighthouse at the very beginning, where if you went inside and looked up, you'd see a black figure peeking out from the top of the staircase and then hide behind it. So maybe my mind was subconsciously primed to see that. However, my main theory is that the first sound I heard was actually real, but was just a creaking noise from somewhere on the floor above me. Then maybe my imagination wandered a little, building things up until I completely imagined that person standing there. However much I want to deny it, the thought that what I witnessed could have been paranormal has crossed my mind. Ultimately, I may never know. What I do know is that from now on, I'll simply turn the lights off and quickly leave the building. I work as a janitor in a large clinic building on the outskirts of town. But don't picture this as some little doctor's office, because it's not. Instead, the inside looks like an airport terminal, with one huge lobby area and a few chairs and tables and an information desk. The actual doctor's offices are on the other side of the wall, with a bunch of doors leading there. This particular clinic provides care to indigent people, including some homeless people as well as those struggling with addiction and mental health issues. For that reason, there is usually at least one dangerous situation a day, such as a patient becoming upset and threatening staff. However, security seemed top-notch, with more than a few guards on duty while the clinic was open. Therefore, I always felt safe. That is, until this incident, which was the most horrifying experience of my entire life. It was 7 o'clock on a weeknight and the clinic had been closed for a while. It was customary for some of the doctors and other staff to stay late and work on whatever they had to, but by this time almost all of them had gone home. On this particular day, I had to scrub the floors, so I was riding one of the floor scrubbers back and forth across the huge lobby area. No kidding, it would normally take me over an hour, and I didn't dilly-dally. I personally didn't hate it, and instead just kind of zoned out while doing it. All of the chairs and tables had been pushed to one side of the lobby, so I wouldn't have to maneuver around them. You could see from one end of the lobby clear to the other, though the other end was far away. I'd already made a few passes with the scrubber when I thought I could hear something. I turned it off for a second and listened. Someone was speaking from somewhere that seemed to be coming from the office side, and as it wasn't directed at me, I kept going. I figured 2 staff members were having a conversation, or someone was speaking on the phone. I made a few more passes, and when I was about halfway done, I stopped so I could use the restroom. I heard the same person speaking, and it struck me as odd. I listened in and realized that they were repeating the same thing over again. I couldn't make out what exactly they were saying though. My curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over to where I thought I heard it. I pressed my ear up against one of the doors leading to the office area, and it sounded like that person was back there. I couldn't tell where exactly. And I still couldn't make out what they were saying. That's when I'd say things started to get creepy. Though the security guards sometimes had problems clearing out all of the patients, they still managed to do so no one was ever left behind. However, I was becoming concerned that one of the patients with mental issues may have somehow managed to hide in one of the rooms. By now there was no one else around, and while I had a master set of keys and could have opened the door, I didn't want to confront someone who was potentially dangerous. Therefore I called the number for clinic security. I'm not sure exactly how things worked, but supposedly it was staffed 24/7 and there was a guard that could come over. I got a hold of the operator and told her that I thought that one of the patients was still in the building. The lady told me she'd send someone over and then ended the call. I wasn't sure what else to do. It didn't feel like a good idea to go back and resume scrubbing the floors in case that person did something, but I also needed to get it done so that I could go home. As I was pondering what to do, the voice stopped. And not like it faded away, no, it stopped abruptly. That somehow made it more creepy, since now I'd be less sure of where that person was. We were near the middle of the building, and the series of hallways in the office area was all connected, so that person could quickly go anywhere. After standing by the door for 30 seconds or so, I decided to just get back on the floor scrubber as I waited for security to arrive. Looking back, that seems like the strangest and one of the dumbest decisions of my life, and to this day I can't fully explain it. As I continued my work, I keep scanning my surroundings and stopping periodically to listen. I didn't see or hear anything. During this time, the fact that I was in a large empty space with a potentially dangerous person nearby started to sink in, and my blood ran cold. Finally, it was like 8:30 and I finished the floors. I technically had one or two other things to do, but I had already made up my mind that I would just leave after the floors were done. I drove the scrubber back over to one of the closets and parked it and plugged it in. Whoever was supposed to show up hadn't done so yet, and I didn't really want to wait for them. Just as I was about to leave the closet and lock it behind me, I heard the talking again. I still couldn't tell where it was coming from, but at least it didn't sound any closer. I walked back into the main hallway and scanned my surroundings. No one was there. All that remained to do at that point was to turn the main lights out and exit the building. That meant I'd have to walk along the entire length of the lobby. I felt a bit bad turning off the lights, since that would mean that whoever was supposed to show up from security would have to turn them on again, but at this point I was over it. As far as I was concerned, I'd done my due diligence. I started at the end furthest from where I parked, and quickly walked from switch to switch. Looking back and seeing each section of the lobby fade into darkness was actually terrifying in that situation. Somewhere around the halfway point, I heard one of the doors swing open in the darkness, but whoever was there wasn't saying anything. I considered it might be the security guard, but I didn't want to risk finding out. I started to move quickly to the exit, not caring about the lights anymore. I also planned to just call 911 when I made it back to my car. What follows is the most terrifying experience of my life. I started to hear footsteps coming from one of the hallways in the office area, and right before I reached the exit, I saw a door swing open and a figure walk outside. I stopped dead in my tracks. The person in front of me was a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He looked homeless, with tattered clothes and long, greasy hair. But the most disturbing part was his eyes. They looked completely insane. At first he didn't say anything, but then he started to speak, and I realized he was saying, "The pain is too much, I need meds." I couldn't tell if he was speaking to me or not, but I slowly started to back up. But then as I did so, he started walking towards me. Instinctively I moved faster, but he seemed to match my speed. A moment later I began running, with the intent of getting to the other end of the building, but I knew that wouldn't work when I realized he was gaining on me. Therefore I got the master key ready and frantically opened one of the doors as my hands trembled. I managed to get halfway inside when I felt a hand reach out and grab me. The man was still repeating the phrase from earlier, but now it was much louder. I screamed and shoved the door closed. The man screamed as it hit his arm, and he let go. I pulled the door shut behind me, locking it. The lights on the office side had already been turned out, with only the dim red glow of the exit signs illuminating the hallways. Based on the fact that the guy was faster than me, I wasn't confident I could make it to one of the back exits in time. Though the doors to the office side had been locked, they could still be opened from the inside. And the man had left at least one of them open, meaning he could get back to where I was. My heart pounding, I found one of the exam rooms and unlocked it, then got inside and locked it again, my hands still trembling. Though I didn't have cell reception in this room, thank God there was a phone. Standing there in the darkness as I picked up the phone was completely surreal, and when the operator came on, I explained the situation as quietly as I could. My life flashed before my eyes as I heard one loud thud on my door, followed soon after by more consistent bangs and that same horrible chant. I yelled at the operator for the police to hurry as I braced myself against the door. While the doors weren't flimsy, this guy was doing some damage, and if he really wanted pain meds and thought I might have them, I doubt he'd quit slamming into it. Since he knew my location, I turned the lights on and looked for something to brace the door. It was no good, as everything was bolted in place. I remembered from a safety training we had that we could wrap a belt around the metal closer at the top of the door to make it harder to open, so that's what I did. Over the sound of bangs, I frantically undid my belt and started wrapping it as tightly as I could around the closer. For 5 minutes I pushed as hard as I could while the man continued body slamming the door from his side, all the while yelling that same phrase. I'm not sure if what I did made any difference, but thank God the man didn't manage to open the door. When the police announced their presence, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It sounded like they were trying to talk him down, but when that didn't work, one of the officers must have tackled him. After a few moments, the other one knocked on my door, letting me know it was safe. I walked out, and they had the man in cuffs. He wasn't looking at either them or me, but he was still speaking. I knew at that point he was completely insane. An ambulance showed up soon after that, and I presumed the man was taken to a hospital for a mental evaluation. I somehow managed to not get a scratch on me, even though the man had grabbed me at one point. And after giving a statement and filling out an incident report, I just went home. I still didn't know if the clinic security personnel ever showed up. The next day and for the following week, the clinic was on high alert, with additional guards stationed in our building. They were able to identify the man, who had had an appointment earlier that day and was in fact mentally ill, but I'm not sure they ever figured out how he managed to hide until after the clinic closed. Luckily, it seemed like this was an isolated incident, and various staff members assured me that extra steps would be taken to avoid something like this happening in the future. I flat out refused to stay late into the evenings, and possibly because they were afraid I might file some kind of complaint, my bosses said that was okay. This incident happened around 2 years ago, and though I still work in that same building, thank God nothing even remotely as frightening has happened. I still get freaked out when the end of the day approaches, and a lot of the staff start to head home. Somewhere, in my subconscious, I still think of that man still being back there waiting for me, and that thought terrifies me to this day.